No início do século XX, sob uma aparente fachada de modernidade, a democracia americana, dela, tem apenas um nome. Nessa época, reina nos Estados Unidos uma atmosfera racista indigna da simples ideia de democracia. Em 1864, a 13ª emenda proclama o princípio da abolição da escravatura. A Guerra da Secessão deixou marcas ainda hoje visíveis. Uma América dividida, uma América segregada. Na verdade, o país permanece estruturado pela racialização que hierarquiza as mulheres e os homens em função da cor da sua pele.
I thought I was free because my dad sheltered us from all years of segregation. He wouldn't let us go to the movies. He wouldn't let us go to the restaurants. He wouldn't let us go to the hotels. He said, I built this house for you. And in this house, there's a kitchen. In this house, there are bedrooms. You don't need to go. So he sheltered us from all of that. But by attending the mass meetings and doing voter registration drives and going to jail, I realized that I wasn't free.
Esta ordem estabelecida só pode manter-se através da violência, do terror e da opressão económica das populações negras em todo o país.
As a white person, you were encouraged to see black people as uneducated, unskilled, fit only for manual labor, and not someone to be friends with, not someone to want to spend time with. And you don't want to go to school together, you don't want to go to church together.
Neste país dominado pela população branca e protestante, há outros grupos com uma existência frágil, como é o caso da comunidade judaica. A história da sua presença em solo americano é marcada por uma incessante passagem de um lado para o outro da linha da discriminação racial. Ao contrário dos negros, os judeus, geralmente vistos como brancos, chegaram livres a este país que por vezes cumpre as suas promessas. Para os mais trabalhadores e afortunados, o American Dream, sonho americano, abrirá os seus braços.
Most Americans believed in the American dream, and Jewish Americans perhaps more than others because our families had immigrated much more recently. We knew that they came, from places where they were oppressed and they were discriminated, and they came here and they believed in the American dream and were just simply outraged at the idea that this other group was obviously, subject to horrible discrimination, that children were getting bombed and spit at and having dogs thrown on them.
Judeus e negros são dois grupos historicamente estigmatizados. Nos Estados Unidos, as suas relações são complexas e muitas vezes tensas. Não está em causa hoje idealizá-las. As suas histórias singulares não podem ser consideradas equivalentes. Porém, no seio destas comunidades, houve mulheres e homens que transpuseram barreiras para se unirem em nome de valores de liberdade, de igualdade, de amor e de amizade.
This is such a powerful example of what happens when two communities come together. They can end segregation. They can fight anti-Semitism. They can promote social change. And for any powers that be that want to preserve white supremacy, this particular example is a direct threat to that.
Atlanta, 1906. Springfield, 1908. St. Louis, 1916. A mecânica é sempre idêntica. Boatos e acusações, muitas vezes infundados, de que homens negros teriam violado ou tentado violar mulheres brancas. E milhares de brancos enfurecidos marcham sobre os bairros afro-americanos. Estes tumultos raciais, como lhes chamam os jornais, são na verdade massacres em massa, que tomam o nome de pogroms, quando as vítimas são as populações judaicas da Europa de Leste. Repetidamente, estes ataques resultam em dezenas ou mesmo centenas de mortos, feridos e lojas e casas destruídas.
The race riot of 1908 was kind of a pushing factor for creating the NAACP. And it was building on the previous Niagara movement that had brought together scholars and activists.
NAACP is really like a sort of multifaceted organization that primarily deals with, say, political rights and political activism, and has a long history of fighting against lynching, fighting against school segregation, and wanting to use sort of the legal system, right, as a primary tool to eradicate racism.
Fundada em 1909, a NAACP, Associação Nacional para o Progresso de Pessoas de Cor, é a organização histórica que desempenhou um papel crucial nas vitórias dos negros. A organização milita pela aplicação dos direitos civis e contra os linchamentos racistas. A NAACP estará na vanguarda de todos os combates. Liderada pelo intelectual William Edward Burghardt Du Bois.
W.E. Du Bois, who's the first African American to graduate Harvard University with a PhD, right, is one of the founders. He's also the founding editor of the Crisis magazine. So he uses the magazine as a way to shed light on the political problems facing African Americans. And so it becomes a kind of, I would say, a sort of a founding sort of institute for really understanding how Black life has dealt with sort of liberal politics in the U.S. and has a long, long history that in some ways has been revered both domestically and globally.
There were many influential African Americans who were founders of the NAACP, but there were also many Jews who both identified with the cause, but also who helped provide the structure and some of the financial support for the NAACP.
Entre os membros judeus da NAACP, o percurso de Lois Marshall é emblemático. Figura eminente da sua comunidade, Lois Marshall é um advogado muito ativo nas causas dos direitos humanos e das minorias nos Estados Unidos. A sua dedicação à causa dos direitos dos negros é movida por um ideal humanista e também por inquietudes pessoais que tinham culminado com o lamentável caso de Leo Frank. Leo Frank é um jovem gerente de uma fábrica que vive em Atlanta. Em 1913, uma adolescente de 13 anos, empregada da fábrica que ele dirige, é encontrada violada e morta. Levianamente acusado, é preso e julgado numa atmosfera antissemita nauseabunda. Condenado e encarcerado, é raptado por um grupo de 24 homens armados que o enforcam durante a noite num simulacro de justiça em que o sul do país se tornara especialista. Este caso constitui um choque para Lois Marshall, que a partir de então não cessará de lutar contra a violência racista. Enquanto a NAACP recorre aos tribunais, outros ativistas e filantropos apostam na área da educação. Nas regiões rurais do Sul, a escravatura foi substituída por um sistema particularmente duro de exploração agrícola em parceria. Após a Guerra da Secessão, as antigas vítimas, agora livres, precisam de trabalhar e os proprietários agrícolas precisam de mão de obra. Concedem então aos negros o direito de cultivarem certas parcelas de terreno, mas a injustiça das regras é tal que os cultivadores se veem frequentemente endividados junto dos proprietários sem escrúpulos. Neste contexto, as populações negras não têm, obviamente, as mesmas possibilidades de acesso à educação. O encontro entre o escritor e militante Booker T. Washington e o filantropo Julius Rosenwald será determinante para várias gerações de crianças negras do sul do país.
When he and Rosenwald met, Booker T. Washington was the most well-known Black man in America. He had written Up from Slavery, a memoir of growing up as a child on a farm in western Virginia as a slave, and then being emancipated at the age of 9, but still not being able to go to school because he had to work helping his family, had managed to become educated at Hampton, a school that had been set up by the Freedmen's Bureau to create teachers.
Booker T. Washington pertence à última geração de líderes negros nascidos sob o regime da escravatura. Em 1865, quando a escravatura é abolida, tem 9 anos. E é a sua experiência pessoal que vai buscar uma convicção inabalável. A de que a educação será a chave da emancipação das populações negras do Sul. E dedica a sua vida a esta causa.
In 1880, when the state of Alabama wanted to create a school for Black teachers, they wrote to the principal of Hampton and requested a well-qualified white man to come down and start this school. And the principal of Hampton said, "I'm sending you Booker T. Washington. I know of no white man who could do better."
Julius Rosenwald, pelo seu lado, é o filho de uma família de judeus alemães que imigraram para os Estados Unidos no século XIX. Empresário talentoso, Rosenwald é também um filantropo visionário, muito preocupado com a situação das populações afro-americanas do seu país.
I think one thing he and Washington had in common, actually, was they were both extremely pragmatic. They saw issues and addressed them. And the issue that Washington saw was people with no education. In 1912, it was Rosenwald's 50th birthday. He celebrated his 50th birthday by giving away $600,000, which is, of course, several million in today's dollars. And 2,500 of that went to Booker T. Washington to encourage schools like Tuskegee in that area. And Washington said, how about if we take 2,500 of that and partner with some communities that are raising money and build schools there? So they built 6 schools. Rosenwald gave $300, the community raised $300, and then the schoolhouse was given to the public school system. At this point, public education was mandatory throughout the South, but the states were dividing their dollars very unequally between the black system and the white system. And so this was a very clever way to encourage participation, not just from the black communities, but from the state, from the local jurisdictions.
Infelizmente, Booker T. Washington morre em 1915. No entanto, Julius Rosenwald e Booker T. Washington tiveram tempo de juntos lançarem as fundações das chamadas Escolas Rosenwald. Entre 1918 e 1932, Julius Rosenwald cria uma rede de 5.000 escolas destinadas às populações negras do Sul.
The thing that attracted Julius Rosenwald to the prospect of building the schools was the fact that the communities were already working to do it themselves. He had very much absorbed Jewish teaching about charity, which is quite different from the Christian concept. You know, charity, caritas, is based on love. That's a powerful motivator. But the Jewish concept is a little different. It's based on justice, and it's based on righteousness, and it's based on the idea that if you have, especially if you have more than you need, it's your responsibility to give, and to give in a way that empowers the recipient. So by helping communities build schools, Julius Rosenwald was strengthening them. He wasn't giving them a handout. He wasn't saying, here's a school. He was saying, okay, you want a school? I'll help you build it.
Paralelamente à criação das primeiras escolas Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington trabalha toda a vida no desenvolvimento do Tuskegee Institute. Sob a sua direção, o Tuskegee Institute torna-se uma verdadeira instituição dedicada à formação das elites negras do Sul, passando a fazer parte da rede das HBCU, Universidades Historicamente Negras. Os negros podem finalmente decidir que conhecimentos eles ou elas irão adquirir. Da agricultura à química, passando pela marcenaria e pela medicina. Para os afro-americanos, está em marcha um movimento de fundo. As novas elites podem, pouco a pouco, impor-se numa sociedade que se esforça por os colocar na base da escala social. Na mesma altura, na Europa, a Alemanha envereda pelo nazismo. Em 1933, Hitler toma o poder. Em abril, decreta um dia de boicote ao comércio judeu. Este foi apenas o princípio de uma política de discriminação sistemática que prepara o pior. No mesmo mês, a lei, dita da restauração da função pública, passa a excluir judeus e opositores políticos. Os professores universitários judeus alemães são assim obrigados a deixar um país que já não os quer e a partir em busca de uma nova terra de acolhimento.
In my opinion, as a scholar, this is one of the most important and overlooked chapters in American history. So our nation's HBCUs have always opened their doors to anyone who wanted to attend from the time they were founded. And they really showed how important this was in the 1930s when Jewish scholars were fleeing Europe. Many of them had to leave everything behind in order to save their lives. And they applied for visas to come to the United States and teach at universities. Many of them, if not most of them, were denied the visas.
Vindos das melhores universidades europeias da época, estes professores, homens e mulheres, imaginam certamente ser acolhidos de braços abertos neste país famoso pela sua modernidade e pelo seu apego à liberdade. Infelizmente, descobrem uma realidade bem distinta.
You still had certain anti-Jewish policies in place in white mainstream institutions of higher learning. It would take a while for there to be a wholesale embrace of Jewish scholars. You would get it, Eric Olbach at Yale, or another example, somebody squeaking in at Harvard. But you still had Jewish restrictions. They really don't lift until the 50s, 60s.
HBCUs saw a fantastic opportunity to do two things. Number one, to improve their own faculty. So these were top scholars coming from the top universities in Europe. And many of them were in the sciences and the social sciences and the arts. And so they wanted these scholars at their institutions, teaching their students. But having experienced so much racism themselves at their institutions and in their communities, they also knew that they had to do the right thing, which was to save these scholars' lives. And so that was the other reason why they extended invitations to these refugee scholars.
É assim que cerca de 50 professores judeus alemães arranjam colocações nas universidades negras. Entre eles, o professor de filosofia Ernst Manasseh, acolhido por James Shepard, presidente e fundador da Universidade Negra da Carolina do Norte. James Shepard agarra a oportunidade de conferir uma dimensão internacional à sua instituição e acolhe, em seguida, 3 outros professores que aí permanecerão até ao fim das suas carreiras. Aquilo que começara como um casamento de conveniência adquire então uma surpreendente dimensão afetiva entre estas duas comunidades aparentemente tão diferentes, mas que estão ligadas por um laço poderoso: a sua experiência da segregação, do racismo e da injustiça. O mundo da educação e o mundo académico são terrenos privilegiados de partilha entre comunidades judaicas e afro-americanas. Saber e desejo de aprender oferecem simultaneamente perspectivas de futuro, espaços de liberdade e os meios para lutar por estas populações marginalizadas. Franz Boas, pai da antropologia americana, trabalhou longamente sobre as culturas autóctones. Segundo ele, cada cultura é o produto de uma história e uma geografia singulares. Defende assim o relativismo cultural e desconstrói as teorias raciais. Na época, esta é uma proposta revolucionária.
He was the foremost proponent of the idea that the environment is much more important than genetic heritage. Racists, of course, hated Boas because it went against everything they believed. They believed there were these inherited characteristics that Jews had, that African Americans had, that they as Aryans and Anglo-Saxons had.
He was very interested in social inequality. He was very interested in relationships between people and race relations. And that's how, in the context in which he met Zora Neale Hurston, who is known as a Renaissance woman, someone who was a thinker, a writer, considered to be the first Black female filmmaker, an anthropologist and folklorist.
Naturalmente, Zora Neale Hurston segue os passos do seu professor e amigo para contestar a abordagem racializada e folclórica da sua comunidade, desenvolvendo um trabalho exaustivo e rigoroso. Empenha-se na criação de uma obra multiforme que pretende restituir a riqueza e a originalidade das culturas negras.
She really went on to become the first person to be an anthropologist of rural Black culture and made just a huge contribution. She studied in Haiti, but then she came and documented folkways in the African American communities.
Franz Boas, one of the great sociologists, urban anthropologists of his day, is just overwhelmed by her brilliance, and she becomes one of his many students, but probably his most famous student. And it's one example of many of Jewish professors being willing to embrace young black students, be they male or female.
Nos anos 30, as grandes cidades dos Estados Unidos vibram ao som do jazz. Apesar do racismo envolvente, esta música negra encontra o seu público. E bares e clubes nova-iorquinos não são exceção. Contudo, a segregação não está ausente destes lugares. Embora os artistas negros estejam em palco, no público, negros e brancos não podem misturar-se. Em dezembro de 1938, Barney Josephson abre o lendário clube de jazz Café Society e faz cair a barreira da segregação racial. Filho de imigrantes judeus letões, abre assim um local único no seu género, a que chama ironicamente The Wrong Place for the Right People.
This cafe was born out of a frustration over how segregated New York City was. So people did not socialize together. Black people went to black clubs and black neighborhoods, and white people went to white clubs and white neighborhoods. And Café Society was founded as an integrated place where black and white people could come together to be sure that they could, they could socialize across racial boundaries, that they could have, conversations.
Café Society, founded by this Jewish brother who wants it to be a countervailing force against segregation, a countervailing force against capitalism, a countervailing force against Nazism. All there in that little site in New York City, which is a site for music and for arts.
Na noite da inauguração do Café Society, uma certa Billie Holiday canta para o público misto. Será a presença constante em palco durante 9 meses consecutivos. Nascido no Bronx, no meio de uma família judaica originária da Rússia, Abel Meeropol é um frequentador habitual do clube. Chocado pelos frequentes linchamentos de negros no sul do país, Meeropol escreve o poema Strange Fruit, que propõe a Billie Holiday através de Barney Josephson. Ela apodera-se da canção e usa para encerrar os seus espetáculos, interpretando-a no meio de um silêncio absoluto.
Meeropol was a strong leftist Jewish brother with fascinating, complicated relations with the Communist Party, high school teacher who was fundamentally committed to the dignity and the freedom of black people as a white Jewish brother.
He had read about the scourge of lynching in the South, and he composed this very short poem that imagined black people as fruit, strange fruit hanging from the trees. And the idea was that lynching was so commonplace, it happened so often, that that's what the way it appeared.
That southern trees bear, black bodies swaying in the southern breeze. But of course, the inimitable, indescribable Billie Holiday from Baltimore City singing the song in the Café Society, founded by the Jewish brother Barney Josephson, that the memories of the pogroms connected with the attacks of black folk in the South. So you got this beautiful intertwining of empathy, solidarity, elective affinity between blacks and Jews. And that's always been a very important source of coming together.
Em 1939 eclode a Segunda Guerra Mundial. A Alemanha nazi não esconde nem as suas intenções de conquista, nem a sua intenção de destruir os povos considerados inferiores e parasitas. Em 1942, a solução final para a questão judaica é decidida. Isto significa a implementação do projeto de extermínio sistemático dos judeus e dos ciganos da Europa. O Holocausto fará 6 milhões de mortos. Nos Estados Unidos, perante o isolacionismo americano, alguns membros da comunidade judaica mobilizam-se para que o presidente Roosevelt se empenhe no salvamento dos judeus europeus. Entre eles, contam-se os Bergson Boys. Estes jovens militantes lançam campanhas publicitárias para interpelar a opinião pública e recebem o apoio de importantes personalidades negras como James Shepard, Zora Neale Hurston ou William Edward Burghardt Dubois.
Du Bois was very interested in how people in the African diaspora understood racism, but he also, as the 20th century advanced, realized that the situation for Jewish people in Europe was dire, and that he wanted to understand what was going on in Europe because, number one, he had Jewish colleagues and he wanted to understand how their families and communities were connected, but he also knew that racism and anti-Semitism were two sides of the same coin.
O pós-guerra é uma nova era para o movimento dos direitos civis nos Estados Unidos. As populações negras, agora globalmente mais instruídas, apoderam-se da cultura para desafiar a segregação racial. Oriunda de uma família abastada e militante da NAACP em Chicago, Lorraine Hansberry exprime o seu talento literário nos palcos de Nova York, onde os seus escritos denunciam o racismo. É aí que encontra o editor Robert Nemiroff, oriundo de uma família judaica e autor de canções. Após o seu casamento, é ele quem produz a principal obra de Lorraine Hansberry, Uma Uva ao Sol, que faz dela a primeira mulher a ter uma peça da sua autoria representada na Broadway. Na verdade, Lorraine Hansberry é homossexual e o casal separa-se ao fim de 4 anos de casamento a preto e branco, algo raríssimo na época. No entanto, a sua colaboração não termina. Robert Nemiroff continuará a levar aos palcos a obra da sua ex-mulher, mesmo após a morte prematura desta aos 34 anos de idade. À imagem de Lorraine Hansberry, há uma nova geração que se mobiliza, estimulada pelos movimentos de emancipação dos povos colonizados. Esta geração leva o princípio da luta política não violenta ao seu paroxismo. Os anos 50 são marcados pelo boicote aos autocarros segregados da cidade de Montgomery, desencadeado pela NAACP, com o gesto histórico da militante Rosa Parks e depois liderado pelo jovem Martin Luther King. Após mais um ano de braço de ferro, o Supremo Tribunal declara a segregação nos autocarros anticonstitucional. Numa luta mais frontal, os militantes passam agora a fazer frente aos seus adversários, pacífica, mas fisicamente.
A very early civil rights bill in the United States, segregation in interstate travel was outlawed. Buses, trains, airplanes, anything that traveled interstate could not have segregated facilities, either on the bus or in the bus stations. But all of the bus stations in the South and all the buses and trains were segregated. So CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, decided to get a group of bus riders, black and white, to travel from Washington, D.C., all the way through the South, including Birmingham, Montgomery, Jackson, Mississippi, all the way to New Orleans, Louisiana. That's what they set out to do in the spring of 1961.
People would ride regular Greyhound buses in pairs, black and white pairs, and black riders would go into white waiting rooms across the route, which initially was planned to go from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans.
They didn't have too much trouble until they got to Alabama. And when the first bus crossed into Alabama, the bus was met by the Ku Klux Klan. They shot the tires out of the bus. They stopped the bus. They broke the windows in the bus, and they threw firebombs into the bus and held the doors shut to try to kill all the Freedom Riders. when I visited them in the hospital at St. Jude's Hospital, I said, well, your freedom ride is over. And they said, oh, no, as soon as we're able to get back on the bus, we're going on to Jackson. And I said, well, if you get treated this way in Alabama, they're going to kill you when you get to Mississippi. And they say, we know that. We've written our wills. So those young people were prepared to give their lives for the principle of riding together on buses in a non-segregated way. And when you see courage like that, you have to join. You have to join up. You can't ignore it. So you have to join them, and that's what I did.
Além dos Freedom Riders não se deixarem demover por estes atos violentos, os grupos de militantes multiplicam-se.
It was the students from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, under the leadership of Diane Nash and John Lewis, and they decided that if the white South was able to stop the Freedom Ride with violence, if they were successful in that, that we wouldn't be able to have very much of a movement, because every time we would start something, the white people would know, well, all we have to do is kill some people and burn up some people, and they'll stop. So the students from Nashville said, we have to keep the Freedom Ride going.
Os Freedom Riders estão dispostos a enfrentar as duras prisões do Sul para obrigarem estes estados a aplicar a lei federal. Vindos de todo o país às centenas, os grupos são compostos por um número igual de negros e brancos dispostos a arriscarem a vida juntos para fazerem frente às forças mais obscuras do seu país.
%30 of the white people that came down were Jewish, and we only make up 2% of the population.
We don't hear as much about Jewish women when we hear about the kind of vaunted Black-Jewish alliance in the civil rights movement. Though they were involved in equal numbers, we just have the sexism of historiography.
There was a sense in the Jewish community that now there's a huge onslaught of racism against Black people, and we as Jews have to be involved because we're next. There's no such thing as the mob being satisfied with just one group of people to oppress.
De 1961 a 1963, a tensão agudiza-se a nível nacional e os confrontos multiplicam-se. A 28 de agosto de 1963, a marcha sobre Washington reúne perto de 300 mil pessoas. A hora é de otimismo. O movimento é mais popular que nunca e o presidente dos Estados Unidos, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, mostra-se mais sensível à causa do que os seus antecessores. O seu assassinato em Dallas, a 22 de novembro de 1963, é um autêntico terremoto. Os ativistas dos direitos civis consideram-no um crime político de extrema-direita. E se o governo não conseguiu proteger o próprio presidente, como esperar que pudesse garantir a segurança do movimento? O Mississippi é o palco do próximo braço de ferro acerca do direito de voto das populações negras. Embora garantido, teoricamente, pela Constituição, este direito fundamental é genericamente travado nos Estados do Sul, o que afeta a via institucional do país.
Mississippi was the state that was most adamant in opposing Black people registering and voting. So we decided we had to have a whole summer program in 1964 in Mississippi called Mississippi Freedom Summer. And we'd invite students, adults, and so forth from all over the country to come to Mississippi and spend the summer of Mississippi registering people to vote,
The idea being, if you got 1,000 white students to come from all over the country and work at registering people to vote, the Klan is unlikely to actually kill white students.
When you were black in the South and you went to register to vote, your constitutional guaranteed right, you would come before a judge or even an official of the court, and they would see that you were a black man or woman. They would start by saying, Johnny, no mister, yeah? And Johnny was not necessarily your name. What are you doing here? This is not for folks like you. And then he would say, read this section from the state constitution. And very often, this black man or woman had not gone to school. And so they couldn't read. So our job as civil rights workers, I came in 65 and 66, but starting in 64 was just to teach people how to read, how to write their name, very basic things.
Before we started traveling, we were doing voter registration drives and picketing and marching. And of course, during the voter registration drives, there was a young man who was 90 years old, had never written his name, had never went to vote. So I personally taught him how to write his name. And upon him learning to write his name, I carried him down to the courthouse to become a registered voter. And at the next election, he was able to vote.
There was so much national attention, people coming from all over the country to go to Mississippi. We had a person in charge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover, who hated civil rights. He hated Martin Luther King, hated all the civil rights organizations, and he went on television right before the first people were supposed to go to Mississippi, and he said, I want everybody in the country to know that the civil rights workers going to Mississippi this summer will have absolutely no protection from the federal government. The federal government will not protect them, which was an invitation to the Ku Klux Klan. Over, they're not going to have any federal protection. Let's just kill whoever comes first. The first people that come, we're going to capture them and kill them. And the first 3 people that came from Oxford, Ohio, after their orientation, Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney, were captured in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and they were taken out of the jail 9, 10 o'clock at night, turned over to the Ku Klux Klan, who took them out and murdered all 3 of them and buried them 18 feet deep in an earthen dam. And that was the beginning of the summer of '64.
Mais uma vez, Ku Klux Klan e a polícia estão conluiados. O objetivo é claro, dissuadir militantes e jornalistas de se dirigirem ao sul. Cheney, Schwerner e Goodman devem servir de exemplo. Tanto mais que o trio encarna tudo o que o Klan detesta. Aos 20 anos, o afro-americano James Cheney já militara com os Freedom Riders. Tendo nascido e crescido no Mississippi, está mais do que qualquer outro consciente dos riscos. Andrew Goodman e Michael Schwerner, pouco mais velhos do que ele, pertencem a famílias judaicas progressistas de Nova York. Deviam servir de exemplo, tornar-se-ão símbolos.
You couldn't be involved in this movement if you didn't understand what was at stake. My friend Andy Goodman had been killed, so we understood what was at risk. But we were the first generation of post-Holocaust Jews, and there was simply no way in which we could look aside to the violation of people's, not just their property, but their lives, their rights, all of those basic issues that here we saw completely destroyed by Nazism. And here we are in the United States of America, and Dr. King needs help. How can we possibly stand aside? And that was it. Very simple.
O rabino Abraham Joshua Heschel é um dos que responde a este apelo. Nascido em 1907 em Varsóvia, Abraham Heschel encontra refúgio nos Estados Unidos em 1939. A mãe e as irmãs deveriam tê-lo seguido, mas as fronteiras fecharam-se cruelmente sobre elas. A sua mãe é assassinada pelos nazis. As irmãs são deportadas e não mais regressarão. Martirizado por ter perdido a família, privado daquele mundo judeu e europeu que tanto amava, Abraham Heschel não suporta a violência do racismo americano. O seu encontro com Martin Luther King afigura-se, pois, uma evidência. Os dois homens partilham uma fé inabalável em Deus, o amor pelas palavras dos profetas e a convicção de que o ser humano é responsável pelo seu destino na Terra.
This is one of the great partnerships, friendships, coming togethers of prophetic figures of the 20th century. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was on fire for a love and care of weak and vulnerable people, building on the genius of Hebrew scripture, which is the spreading of Hesed, the spreading of steadfast love or loving kindness to the orphan and widow, the fatherless and motherless and persecuted and exploited and subjugated.
Dr. King was not for us some foreign entity. He was a soul brother for us too. He was not your typical Protestant minister who spoke most of the time about Jesus. He really spoke to the prophetic tradition. So he was speaking to us. And every moment that went by that we didn't respond, we knew that we were not living up to our own values. These were prophets wrote in the Hebrew language. They were Jews. And he was saying in their words, get up and do something.
Selma sprang overnight from an obscure southern town to the front pages of world newspapers. This church was headquarters in the Negro Drive for the right to vote, and it was here that Martin Luther King came to lend his support to the campaign. He pointed out that from Selma's 14,000 Negroes, only a few more than 300 had been registered at the polls.
As populações negras do Sul reclamavam agora a aplicação dos seus direitos constitucionais. O direito a votar para escolherem o seu presidente, mas também o seu governador e até o seu xerife. É um violento braço de ferro que irá ter lugar em Selma, neste mês de março de 1965. Violentamente reprimidas, as primeiras marchas organizadas pelo SNCC fazem um morto, Jimmy Lee Jackson, e dezenas de feridos. Martin Luther King, que está há meses em negociações a fim de obter o apoio do presidente Johnson, vem apoiar os manifestantes no terreno. O presidente é avisado. Será considerado responsável pelos acontecimentos de Selma. Se por infelicidade na segunda marcha o sangue voltar a correr, ele arcará com a culpa de não ter protegido os manifestantes dos homens do terrível e notoriamente racista Sheriff Jim Clark. Ao aproximarem-se das forças da ordem, King decide fazer uma paragem para rezar e, em seguida, volta para trás. Desta vez, os homens do xerife não poderão investir sobre os manifestantes e esta marcha funciona como uma última chamada à atenção do presidente Johnson. Nessa mesma noite, o reverendo James Reeb é espancado até à morte por membros do Ku Klux Klan. 15 dias depois é organizada uma nova marcha, com o objetivo de proteger os manifestantes através da mediatização. King e os militantes apelam a personalidades de todo o país, entre elas Abraham Heschel.
My father received a telegram. It was actually at our home that it came. He was in his study at the seminary on a Friday afternoon, asking my father to join the marchers in Selma on Sunday. And when my father left, it was a very nervous Shabbat for us in my home. And my father made Havdalah, the prayer at the end of the Sabbath. And then we went down the elevator in our building with him, and we were outside, and I remember very vividly, he bent down and kissed me goodbye. And I held on to that kiss because I thought this may be my last kiss from my father. And he got in the taxi and he left. And of course I was worried. But I also knew, because of how he talked to me, that this was the most important thing anybody could be doing at this moment.
He says that Martin is an extension of the freedom movement that began with Moses. Hebrew scripture. It's powerful. You see, so he connects the enslavement of the Israelites by the Pharaoh and connects it to the enslavement and Jim Crowing and Jane Crowing of black people by the U.S. government. The U.S. government becomes Pharaoh.
A terceira marcha de Selma tem então lugar, desta vez sob a proteção das autoridades federais. Os manifestantes poderão chegar a Montgomery, a capital do estado do Alabama, a fim de exigirem o acesso aos seus direitos civis. Durante 5 dias, marcham infatigavelmente. À partida, uns escassos 300, serão 25.000 à chegada.
The Civil Rights Movement, and Dr. King in particular, by focusing on the Hebrew Bible, actually gave us pride in being Jewish, pride in our Bible, pride that somehow our Bible was contributing to this important movement. I think that he restored our souls after the Holocaust. He gave us something, a balm, a salve, something for people who were terribly traumatized. And now it felt just like someone said to my father, "You're a rabbi to the world." I think Dr. King was a pastor to all of America and beyond.
Três anos depois, a 4 de abril de 1968, Martin Luther King é assassinado. Mas o pastor já tinha entrado para a posteridade. Deixou à humanidade uma herança espiritual que transcende as comunidades e as religiões.
Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, he said, I think one of the most important things, he says, the future of America depends on the American response to the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. He says, if you don't deal with racism, materialism, militarism, and poverty, you're going to lose your democracy.
Nos Estados Unidos, as relações entre as comunidades judaica e afro-americana não são nem simples nem idílicas. Por vezes até são violentas. No entanto, une-as uma longa tradição de afinidades, solidariedade e até de amizade. Aliás, estas duas identidades não são exclusivas uma da outra. É possível ser negro e judeu. Da ação política à produção de grandes obras culturais, estes laços estão na origem de alguns dos mais ilustres capítulos da história do país. Martin Luther King e Abraham Heschel, Booker T. Washington e Julius Rosenwald, Franz Boas e Zora Neale Hurston, Abel Meeropol e Billie Holiday, Lorraine Hansberry e Robert Nemiroff, os Freedom Riders ou os militantes do Freedom Summer e tantos outros. Todos eles se empenharam na mesma causa, movidos pelas suas profundas e íntimas convicções, pela sua história, os seus terrores e as suas esperanças. Desde sempre foi necessário e continua a ser enfrentar a besta imunda, aquela que racializa o mundo para melhor o dominar, aquela cujo ventre, segundo Bertolt Brecht, ainda é fecundo.